Sweat trickled down Rafael's forehead, blurring his vision. It wasn't the typical heat of Santo Andre that early afternoon, but the familiar dread that always seized him whenever he approached the imposing Santo Andre cable-stayed bridge, the suspended structure that crossed the Temanduati River. The steel cables, which to many represented modernity and engineering, were to Rafael menacing tentacles stretched over an abyss. With every meter his old Prisma advanced, the feeling of the structure's fragility beneath his tires became more vivid, almost palpable. But today, something was different. A cold, suffocating anxiety, denser than usual, tightened his chest. A premonition so vivid it felt like déjà vu. In the back seat, a group of American tourists, fresh from Guarulhos and excited by the urban landscape, barely noticed the driver's nervousness. They pointed at the colorful buildings, took photos with their state-of-the-art cell phones, and chatted animatedly in English about the chaotic traffic and vibrant architecture. Their voices, once distant, now seemed muffled by the growing pulse in his ears, an incessant drumming that drew him into a private abyss. As the car climbed the ramp to the bridge, the sight became unbearable. In a dizzying instant, reality warped, the urban landscape of Santo Andre fragmented. He no longer saw the solid, imposing bridge stretching before him. Instead, a scene of cinematic horror unfolded before his eyes, with shocking details and terrifying realism. The thick suspension cables detached from the pylon with deafening snaps, like torn tendons of a concrete giant. The metal structure groaned, twisting like an agonizing being, and chunks of concrete and asphalt plunged into the dark, polluted river below, raising clouds of dust and debris. Cars, once tiny, colorful dots in the vastness of the bridge, fell one by one, in a macabre ballet of twisted metal and screams silenced by distance and the imminent crash. A guttural cry escaped Rafael's throat, a primal sound of terror. Without thinking, his feet acted on their own, driven by a wild survival instinct. He slammed on the brakes with brutal force, throwing his body forward against the seatbelt. The tires screeched in a piercing roar that cut through the afternoon air. In his sudden, clumsy move, he wrenched the steering wheel with all his might, making the car spin in an uncontrolled U-turn in the middle of the lane. The passengers who had been smiling moments before were flung against their seats, their shouts of surprise and anger echoing in the small space of the car, mixing with "What are you doing?" and "Are you crazy?" Rafael ignored them completely, his eyes glued to the rearview mirror. He was driving against traffic, an act of madness in the midst of heavy traffic. Horns blared deafeningly, drivers yelled obscenities, and chaos erupted around him, a hurricane of anger and confusion. But Rafael didn't care. His mind was fixed on a single image, the collapsing bridge, the abyss calling. He saw the terrified expressions on his passengers' faces, but he didn't hesitate. Then it happened. A deafening crash shook the air, a guttural sound of metal twisting and concrete shattering that seemed to tear the very fabric of reality. Rafael's car rocked violently, like a boat in a storm. In the rearview mirror, he saw it. The bridge, moments before a robust structure, was now a shapeless mass of debris plunging into the river with a gigantic thud, raising a massive wave of dark water, earth, and garbage spreading across the banks. A shocked silence hung inside the car. The tourists, who seconds before had been furious, now stared at the scene with wide, horrified eyes, pale and trembling. They had seen the bridge collapse. They had been on the brink of death. And Rafael's insane act, his desperate flight, had saved them. By an inexplicable miracle, they were alive. The relief they felt was fleeting, a passing breeze before the storm that Rafael knew was coming. In the days that followed, the image of the collapsing bridge haunted Rafael with cruel persistence. Sleep was a luxury, as his nightmares dragged him back to that infernal moment, reliving the crash, the screams, the sensation of freefall, and the dark water rushing closer. The media buzzed with news of the disaster. News teams from across the country camped near the river. Cameramen captured aerial footage of the destruction, and engineering experts debated the possible causes of the collapse. The city of Santo Andre plunged into mourning and shock, and Rafael was, to many, an anonymous hero. His act of madness recounted in reports, though no one knew the true reason for his actions. The initial relief of having saved his passengers, however, quickly dissipated, replaced by a growing unease, a dark premonition that chilled him to the bone. The first news that reached him was subtle, almost a whisper amidst the buzzing of information. Donna Cecilia, the elderly lady with white hair and a welcoming smile who had been his passenger, died in her home in a neighboring district. The cause? Multiple organ failure, the doctor said. But the woman's grandson, a neighbor of Rafael's, commented with a frightened tone that she seemed to have been crushed by something invisible, found under an overturned cabinet, as if a colossal force had violently struck her. Rafael felt a chill run down his spine. A coincidence, perhaps. The second death wasn't long in coming, hitting Rafael like a punch to the gut, taking his breath away. Pierre Almeida, the young exchange student, one of the liveliest and most cheerful of the tourist group, was found lifeless in his apartment in the city center. The police were investigating, but initial reports spoke of mechanical asphyxiation, as if something had strangled him. There were no signs of a struggle, no signs of forced entry on the door or windows. Only the young man's body, with an expression of frozen terror on his face, eyes wide, skin bruised. Rafael could no longer ignore the facts. They weren't coincidences. It couldn't be. Something was happening, something dark and inexplicable, a force beyond human comprehension. Death was collecting what the bridge failed to take, reaping the lives that he, by an inexplicable chance, had saved. His passengers were dying, one by one, in ways that defied logic, as if an invisible entity was finishing the job that the bridge's collapse had started, a kind of macabre collection. He tried to warn the police, desperate for help. He called the station, scheduled a meeting. He told his story in detail, the vivid premonition, the mysterious deaths, and the bizarre circumstances. The reactions varied between veiled skepticism and thinly disguised pity. "It's post-traumatic stress, Mr. Rafael," an investigator said with a condescending tone, offering him a glass of water and a leaflet about psychological support for disaster victims. The mind plays tricks in moments of great tension and trauma. Rafael left the police station with an even greater sense of emptiness and despair. No one believed him. No one would help him. He was alone, fighting a force that seemed determined to complete its work, to claim the lives he had by an inexplicable chance spared. The nightmare hadn't ended with the bridge's fall. In fact, it was just beginning. And now, the threat was invisible and omnipresent. Media coverage of the Santo Andre cable-stayed bridge collapse did not diminish. On the contrary, it intensified daily. Reporters from all over the country camped near the river, setting up tents and equipment. Cameramen captured aerial footage of the destruction with drones, showing the open wound on the urban landscape. Experts in engineering, geology, and urban planning were invited to debates on news channels, discussing the possible causes of the collapse: structural failure, inadequate maintenance, material fatigue, even soil quality. Rafael followed everything on television, sitting on his dusty couch, feeling a knot of anxiety in his stomach with each new report, each image of what remained of the bridge. Interviews with the few survivors who weren't in his car, with witnesses to the disaster, with victims' families. Everything echoed in his mind, amplifying his anguish and sense of helplessness. He noticed, with a chilling shiver that ran down his spine, the people who survived the disaster, those who were in other vehicles, and managed to brake in time or swerve, were also starting to experience strange health problems or disturbing phenomena. A bus driver who had managed to stop just meters from the abyss, with his tires almost at the edge of the precipice, was hospitalized days later with fulminant pulmonary disease that doctors couldn't explain, attributing it to an atypical bodily reaction. A cyclist who was lucky enough to be at the beginning of the bridge at the moment of collapse reported in interviews that she suffered from constant sleep paralysis and saw shadows in her room, shapeless figures that seemed to watch her in the dark. The stories, though not directly linked to the deaths of his passengers, were too unsettling to ignore. Rafael began to trace a pattern, an invisible web of misfortunes that seemed to entangle everyone who had been near that fateful event. It was as if the bridge had taken not only lives, but also a curse, a negative energy that was now spreading, contaminating everything and everyone who dared to cross its path on the day of the disaster. Rafael's paranoia grew daily, becoming a thick fog that obscured his mind. He avoided leaving his apartment, the curtains always drawn, his cell phone always at hand, waiting for the next macabre news, the next call announcing another death. His eyes scanned every shadow, every suspicious movement in his peripheral vision. He started seeing fleeting figures in the corner of his eyes, hearing indistinct whispers when he was alone in the oppressive silence of his apartment. His mind, once focused solely on his acrophobia, was now dominated by an even greater fear. The fear of the invisible, of the inexplicable. The fear of death that followed him closely, like a persistent shadow. Every creak in the wood, every groan of the building, was a constant reminder that he wasn't safe. That the creature, or whatever it was, could be closer than he imagined. Inertia was unbearable for Rafael, a silent torture that gnawed at him from within. Ignored by the police and consumed by the anxiety that prevented him from living, he knew he had to act, that his life and the lives of the remaining passengers depended on his own investigation. He plunged headfirst into a virtual ocean of information, spending hours on end at his computer, researching paranormal phenomena, hauntings, ancient curses, and dark entities. His search led him to obscure internet forums, discussion groups about the supernatural where people from different places shared inexplicable experiences and bizarre theories, many of them falling into folklore and charlatanry. But others, inexplicably, resonated with his own reality. He researched urban legends involving bridges, stories of structures built on cursed lands, indigenous burial grounds, or with human sacrifices. He found accounts of bridges where inexplicable accidents became frequent, where people felt observed by invisible presences, or where strange phenomena were witnessed, such as fleeting figures and disembodied voices. Every story, no matter how implausible it seemed, fueled his growing conviction that he wasn't crazy, that there was an explanation, however terrifying, for what was happening. Rafael also sought more in-depth information about the passengers he had saved and who were now dying. He discovered that Donna Cecilia was not just a well-known local healer, but also an amateur researcher of local Santo Andre history and legends, with a particular interest in ancient rituals and indigenous beliefs of the region. Pedro, the exchange student, was not just an archaeology enthusiast, but was in São Paulo for a research project on historic ritual sacrifice sites, focusing on areas where large infrastructure works had been built. Was there something in their lives, something in their pasts, something in their knowledge that connected them to the entity that was pursuing them, or that made them specific targets? With each new discovery, the web became more complex, more intricate, like a macabre puzzle. Rafael began to assemble a mural in his apartment, transforming the living room wall into a tangled mess of information. He pinned photos of the passengers, newspaper clippings about the bridge, news about the mysterious deaths, handwritten notes, and scribbled symbols he found in his research. He connected the information with colored lines and arrows, trying to find a pattern, a logic amidst the chaos, a clue that would lead him to the origin of the curse. He was obsessive, and he knew it, but there was no other choice. The lives of his passengers, the few that remained, and his own, depended on it. He had to find a way to stop it before it was too late. The nights became Rafael's worst torment. The darkness brought with it the sensation of being watched, the heightened perception that something lurked in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. He slept little, always with one eye open, his body tense, every muscle coiled, ready to react to any sign of danger, however subtle. The apartment, once a refuge, now felt like a trap. One night, exhausted and on the verge of collapse, he fell asleep on the sofa, his paranormal research still open on his laptop, the screen casting a pale light on his pale face. He woke with a start to a sound. It wasn't a physical noise, audible to the ears, but a deep, constant hum that seemed to vibrate within his bones, resonating in his skull. The temperature in the apartment dropped dramatically in a matter of seconds, and Rafael's skin bristled with the biting cold that permeated the air. The air grew heavy, dense, as if all moisture had been sucked out of the room. His eyes widened in the dark, searching for the source of the phenomenon. In the middle of the living room, where before there was nothing but the rug and the coffee table, a dense, shapeless shadow slowly began to materialize. It had no defined contours, no discernible human features. It was just a dark mass, darker than the night itself, that seemed to absorb the little ambient light, turning the corner of the room into a well of gloom. From it emanated a biting, almost freezing cold, and an overwhelming sensation of despair, rage, and an ancient malevolence. Rafael couldn't move. He was paralyzed by fear, his body locked in a rigid posture, his breath caught in his throat, every heartbeat echoing like a drum in his ears. He tried to scream, to call for help, but no sound escaped, just a muffled wheeze. The shadow moved slowly towards him, creeping across the floor like a living pool of ink, and Rafael felt the air grow heavy, the pressure in his chest increasing to the point of suffocation. There was no doubt. This was the invisible entity, the force that was killing his passengers, and now it was here before him. The shadow hovered over him, and Rafael felt as if icy, invisible claws tightened around his throat, cutting off his breath. At the same time, his mind was flooded with images, not his own, but those of the entity. He saw the bridge, not his, but an ancient, rustic bridge built of stones and wood, and beneath it, the despair of people, the moment of a sacrifice. It wasn't his premonition. These were the entity's memories, reliving the moment of its initial victory, a macabre ritual. Rafael knew he was dying. The entity was finishing what the bridge started, collecting the souls that had been denied to it. But then, a glimpse. Amidst the overwhelming terror, he saw an unexpected image. Not a vision of the future, but a fragmented, distorted memory of the entity itself. The bridge, not as a pile of concrete and metal, but as a tunnel. A dark, ancient tunnel carved into rock, pulsating with a malignant energy. And inside the tunnel, a dark figure, watching, waiting. It wasn't a concrete bridge, but a portal, a point of connection. The grip on Rafael's throat intensified. The darkness of the shadow enveloped him. The air left his lungs. He was on the verge of collapse, but the image of the tunnel, for a second, propelled him with an inexplicable force. With a superhuman effort, gathering the last vestiges of his will, he forced his body to move and, in a desperate act, kicked the air, striking the shadow. Nothing physical, but the act, the intention, had an immediate and unexpected effect. The shadow recoiled with a kind of inaudible hiss, as if hit by an invisible, repulsive force. The temperature rose, the pressure rapidly decreased, and Rafael gasped, coughing, his body trembling uncontrollably, sweating and cold at the same time. The shadow slowly dissipated into the darkness, leaving only the icy trail of its terror and the smell of mold and damp earth. Rafael was exhausted, but alive. The encounter with the entity had left him with a new and terrifying certainty. He wasn't just an accidental victim, but a specific target. The creature wanted to finish what it had started, and Rafael was the last on its list. The final link in the chain of lives he dared to save. The image of the tunnel bridge was still etched in his mind. An enigmatic clue, but perhaps the only one he had. Driving through the cold Santo Andre night, his hands gripped the Prisma's steering wheel, his knuckles white with strain. His eyes were fixed on the road, scanning every curve, every shadow. The adrenaline from the encounter still pulsed through his veins, keeping him alert but also leaving him on the verge of physical and mental exhaustion. He tried to organize his thoughts, the image of the tunnel bridge still fresh in his memory. What did it mean? An origin point for the entity? A weak spot? The city was asleep, the streets empty and silent, illuminated only by the yellowish lampposts. Rafael drove on, without a clear destination, just a visceral need to get away from the apartment, from the place where the shadow had visited him, where death had almost claimed him. The acrophobia, which once dominated him and controlled his actions, now seemed small, almost insignificant, in the face of the cosmic terror that haunted him. Then he saw it. Kilometers away, in the middle of nowhere, in an abandoned industrial area he barely recognized, the silhouette of the collapsed cable-stayed bridge rose against the night sky, overcast with clouds. It wasn't a mirage caused by sleep deprivation, nor a mere torturous memory of his trauma. It was the structure itself, but not in the place where it should be, over the Tamandueti. It was there, before him, imposing and spectral, cutting across the landscape of warehouses and vacant lots. There was no river, no cars on what remained of the bridge, just the phantom bridge, as if it had been torn from its original bed and planted there by an invisible force, defying the laws of physics and reason. Rafael's heart gave a violent leap, beating like an uncontrolled drum in his chest. He slammed on the brakes abruptly, the car skidding slightly on the empty street, the tires protesting with a sharp screech. His eyes widened in disbelief and terror. The real bridge had fallen. It was submerged in the dark, muddy waters of the Tamandueti, many kilometers away. He was in another district of Santo Andre, far from the river and the disaster site. But the bridge was there, before him, like a promise of doom, a material manifestation of the nightmare that pursued him. Was it a hallucination? A trick of his exhausted mind? A physical manifestation of the threat that surrounded him? Or a warning that the entity was approaching, and he would be next? The phantom bridge pulsed with a sinister energy, an almost imperceptible glow emanating from its twisted cables and girders. And Rafael knew, with a chill that ran down his spine, that the nightmare was far from over. In fact, a new and more dangerous phase was just beginning, and the bridge, in all its forms, seemed to be the key to unraveling the mystery. What did this phantom bridge mean for Rafael? Was it a gateway for the entity, or a clue to stop it? And what did the entity truly want by pursuing the survivors?